G'day, Jeff McCormick here. Welcome back to AGS 405, Consultancy for Farming Systems. And today we're briefly just going to look at farming systems and really under the lens about where does a consultant or what opportunities are there for a consultant to be involved in that. So why should consultants think about farming systems? So when we think about systems in general, they look not only at the components, but how they connect and how they work together. So having a systems approach to something helps us gain understanding, control over complexity, and defining the level at which you understand the system. So already if we consider a farm, often farms will have multiple enterprises, they have multiple components, they are connected in multiple different ways. So as a consultant, if you make a decision, it's likely it won't have just a simple impact on one paddock at one time, okay? But it can have an impact on the whole system. So systems thinking is a way of looking at the world around us, and that emphasizes wholeness and relationship. And really, as a consultant, we're thinking about problems solving. So problems involving part of are considered in relation to the way the whole system works and the environment which it operates. So when we look at farms, there is a complexity. That is one of the things that occurs, and when I talk to people who are on farms, there's a certain level of complexity that they're dealing with. When there's a lot of complexity, they're often really very busy, okay, trying to keep all the balls in the air. And I've also heard farmers make decisions to try and reduce their complexity to be able to manage their system better. And so as a consultant, you need to consider, am I adding increased complexity to a farmer's system, or am I making it less complex? And the reason is because I tend to think farmers will go towards trying to have a less complex system because it enables them to manage it better. And so if any idea that you come up with, no matter how good it sounds, if it's more complicated, adding more complications to the farming system, it's difficult to see how it would be incorporated. All right, so the more complex the system, the more factors there are to consider, the more interactions and therefore reactions there'll be to any modifications of the system. So in a complex system, you are unlikely to find a simple solution to a problem. Okay, so this is a really important point. In a complex system, you're unlikely to find a simple solution. So generally there's trade-offs in all course of action, so rather than solve problems, we seek opportunities to improve situations. And that's very true for farming systems. So when you think about farming systems, and you might see some stuff in the media, someone's changed their farming system to this particular type of system, and now everything is perfect. It's like there's a silver bullet. It's solved all the problems. You know instantly that you should not be listening to the advice that person gets, because whenever you change something, there'll be trade-offs, okay? Not all of those changes will result in all positive benefits, but there'll be some limitations, there'll be some negative effects. That is simply the way it is. So when providing advice on farm, all right, we need to think about improving the situation rather than that we will find a perfect solution that'll make everything all sorted, okay? There is always complexity around that. So we'll remind ourselves when we think about a system, we need to create a boundary around it. And often if you're working with a farm, it's based on that farm itself. But you could always be consulting to a region or a catchment area, and you might have to pick or be specific about what that boundary looks like. And it separates the system from the environment. And we'll come back and describe the environment, what I really mean by that in a little bit later. But it's an important aspect because it's really discerning what you have control over and what you don't have control over. So this is just a reminder that agricultural systems are disturbed ecosystems. Agriculture is a human activity. And so we can think about ecosystem being part of the natural environment, okay, but it's people who implement agriculture into that natural environment. And as soon as there's people, there's a social system. So what that means, particularly in consultancy, is that we need to understand the people. We need to understand the people problem. We can get a good grip of whether it's the agronomy or the animal science or the whatever that problem is, okay? But there's always a human aspect to it that we have to be able to navigate as well. So we could draw models or systems models for a range of different farming enterprise. I mean, that's not really the focus of this subject, but it's important for you to think about for a farm or as a consultant that you might be visiting. It is likely that there's a whole range of things that are going on, okay, and you could effectively describe them by a model. So this is simply looking at a dairy farm situation. Obviously got pasture fodder in there as well. We've got Friesian cows over here, and we've got relationships between all of those things. Why do we want to get some understanding of that? And you might not want to draw this out formally or work through it with a farmer. Okay, that's not the intention here, but the intention is to alert you that any change here to the pasture fodder system will have an impact on the Friesian milk production system. Irrigation or rainfall will have an impact on that pasture forage system. How it's managed, okay, will be impacted, and the nutrient status will be impacted. So just one change in here will impact all those other components. And we need to appreciate that when we're on farm, particularly as we're giving advice, that we're giving good advice that understands where that grower fits within the system. You could make a much more complicated system here, and this is a slightly different chicken meat production. And it's been done for a certain purpose, more around environmental impacts. But you can see all these components that have been brought in, and there's farm subsystems here, the feed production system. There's these external things out here that also have an impact. But it really goes to demonstrate not only the components, but the interaction that is involved there. And once again, we have another example of a dairy farm, and this time it's around greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see once again, there's pastures, talking about pastures in here, and grazing, feed. All right, everything, all the different components are linked together. A change to one component is likely to impact other components. So here's a simple scenario. We could talk about winter cleaning of pastures. All right, winter cleaning of pastures is in the middle of winter, coming in, using a herbicide, and we're thinking predominantly here of legume pastures, and the target is grasses. So if we winter clean our pastures, we will have a grass-free pasture. All right, that has a benefit because there's likely to be less root disease when we come out of that pasture for later cereal crops, and then we will achieve higher yields with our cereal crops because we've got more nitrogen fixation, less disease. Okay, and so one aspect, cleaning our winter pastures, okay, will have a benefit, a likely benefit of increased yields. But that's not the only impact. All right, we could essentially draw lots of different impacts as well, in terms of whether it's herbicide use, increased grain protein, maybe we're increasing acidification, maybe feed quality is improved. There are all sorts of aspects. So even a simple change can impact some of what goes on in that system. We could also think of a soft system. So this probably isn't consulting on an individual farm, but this might be with local land services. It could be with Department of Primary Industries. It could be local community groups, farming systems groups, those kinds of things. This is what you might call sort of a mind map, and it's talking about the Murrumbidgee catchment here and what used to be the Catchment Management Authority. And these are all the groups, all right, involved in that situation. Okay, it's mainly around salinity and making change. And it's clear, so we're going to describe this as a soft system because it's all about people. All right, if you want to make a significant change across a region, you got to be talking to lots of people, having meetings with lots of groups, understanding where their priorities are to be able to make a difference. And so there is increased complexity there. Need to appreciate the human side as well. So we can talk about hard systems, and they behave in a consistent, predictable way. We could talk about machines, structures, computers, problem solving. Relatively straightforward solutions are usually agreed. Soft systems involve humans. And when you're thinking about farms, the decision making that goes on always involves humans. So we're thinking about when the system's applied to biological situations, seldom agreement on one best or final solution. One thing to appreciate as a consultant is, as the saying goes, there's many ways to skin a cat. All right, there are multiple right answers when consulting on a farm. There's unlikely to be one specific outcome that is the only right outcome. And when you're changing one part of the system, you can change the entire system. All right, so we're thinking about farm systems. So we're going to think about describing a farm system. Now, we've probably touched on some of these areas before in other subjects, but the reason we're coming back to them is to look at it through a lens of being a consultant. Okay, and my hypothesis here, okay, is essentially this needs to be known as a consultant. You need to think about this even when you're going to an individual farm. All right, these 5 things are important for you to be able to manage, to be able to give good advice, to be able to be respected for the advice you give on those farms, as opposed to just coming in and giving your own solution. So we're going to talk about objectives, we're going to talk about environment, resources, components, and finally, management. So we talk about the objectives of a system, okay, and we're thinking about farming systems. They all exist for a purpose, okay? The farmer is doing it for a reason. We can measure the performance of these farms against these objectives, and objectives are shaped by the farm manager's values. Okay, that's an important component. As a consultant, do you understand the values of the farm manager to understand what their objectives are? And the farm managers, they're not always going to be aware of their own values and therefore their own objectives. So it might be simple to say, for a farmer to say, I just need to make money. But the reality is they'll make decisions for a range of reasons, often based around family, maybe based on succession planning, maybe based on environmental thoughts and wanting to do better for the land that they have. And so as a consultant, you need to be aware of what the objectives of the farmer is, because it will really change the advice. Remember, as a consultant, you are trying to help your client to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. There's no point achieving your goals for a client. You need to achieve their goals. So being able to understand what they're like is really important. And as said, most farmers aren't sitting around thinking about, oh, what are my goals for this? Okay, they haven't tried to articulate them in that sense, but you'll get a feel for when you meet them that some are definitely the money aspect is the driving feature of why they're doing business. Others, it's the lifestyle. This is what I do. This is who I am. Others, it's for family. We need to set this up for future generations. All of that will have or can make a different impact on the decisions that you might make. When we think about the systems environment, it's more than just what we'd normally think about the natural environment, okay? But the environment we're going to describe as everything that's outside the system, and importantly, it's outside the system's control. Really important as a consultant that you understand those things that are outside of the system, okay, that you can't control. Because the reality is, okay, you can't do anything to influence those factors, but the environment outside of your system has an impact or a determination on the system's performance. So if you're giving advice, you want to understand what are those aspects that sit outside the farm that we can't control or manipulate, but they can have a significant impact on us. So as you think about decisions involved with decision makings around risk, and decision makings on investment, you need to understand what some of these factors are. So if we identify some of those factors, all right, the environment affects the strategic, tactical, operational decision making on farm. Okay, so some of the operational, the immediate decisions, or the strategic, looking years in advance, understanding what environment the farm operates in will have an impact. So when I'm thinking of what a systems environment means, this is things that are outside the boundary. Obviously, climate and weather is a large one. Can't control the amount of rainfall. Can't control the irrigation water allocation. Can't control hot temperatures or frosts that come through. But all need to be part of decision making for the consultant. Okay, there is no point in suggesting a new strategy or even a new wheat cultivar if it tends to flower a bit too early and is likely to be hit by frosts in more years than not. All right. What you're doing when you're selecting a cultivar is trying to manage the risk associated with that environment that operates outside the system. But it's more than that. Markets and supply value chain, such an important part. And because we have such a strong reliance on export markets, we are at the mercy of what those global markets do. We, as an individual in particular, have very little control over those markets, but they have a big impact on us. Political systems and regulations, so changes in legislation that will come through, will have a big impact on the farm and the farming systems. Private business. Okay, how that operates. So maybe you are working for private business in terms of your consultancy, or if you're an independent consultant in that sense. Private businesses, okay, if we could talk about banks and financing, we could talk about the agricultural resellers. How many of them are available or truly independent now? A number of them emerged in recent years. There's also social systems. Surrounding the farm is a community, and the community there will have different expectations around what happens. It's very difficult for a farmer to go against social expectations. All right, thirdly, the resources of a system. And this is key because these are some of the levers that a consultant can pull to try and change the outcome of what's happening. Because really, they're the means available within the system to enable the activities or processes needed to realize the system's goals or objectives. What does that mean? It means the farmer has goals and objectives. They have some level of resources. That's the means. They're able to do things because they have resources to be able to do that. If they don't have resources in one area, or in a particular area, or enough resources, they might not be able to do that. So you need to understand the resources available to the grower to be able to meet their goals or their objectives. So if we look at some of these examples, There's obviously the natural capital. All right. So that once again comes into climate and soils, those kinds of things. So soil in particular, and just where you sit. Okay. Obviously you can't grow crops in certain regions. Okay. That's just how it is. No matter what the farmer's goals were, okay, the location has a big impact on what you can do. So you need to obviously appreciate that. Produced economic capital. All right, so here we're talking about cash, assets, all right, infrastructure on farm. Okay, if a farm doesn't have a shearing shed, it's very difficult to have a very large merino flock. All right, you need to understand what the resources of the system are to provide good advice in terms of being able to realise the goals of the farmer. Social capital is around the community, around and the ability to connect with individuals. And human capital is a really big one. When you're meeting with your grower, what is the personal capacity of being able to do that? Are they reliably going to be able to implement the recommendation that you've made? If they're not going to be able to do it, if they don't have the personal ability or the capacity to do it, you're really setting them up for failure. You got to understand that. So that could be abilities or health. Okay? So knowing that, understanding their knowledge and skills, interpersonal skills, but it's also if they've got staff, they've got other people, or if they don't have staff. Maybe there's no way they could implement that because it's simply one farmer on their own managing their farm. Suddenly it gets very difficult. But if there was 2 extra staff, maybe that would be possible. But so when you're giving advice, you need to consider the resources that are available to the grower. So it could be simple as, if you're making a recommendation for change and they need to get finance for it, are they likely to have enough equity with the bank to even get finance to do that? It would be a poor recommendation for a consultant to not be able to identify that the farmer can't afford to do those changes. Okay, so when you're discussing, you're understanding that what the objectives of the farmer is, but you need to understand what their resources are. Is it possible within their means to be able to achieve their goals and their outcomes? So I've talked a little bit about components and their recognisable parts of the system. And within a farm, there's 3 sort of biological main components: soils, animals, and plants. There's also the business component, the people component. And so we can break that down a lot further depending on how we want to, I guess, investigate some of these areas. But what you need to consider, all right, what you need to consider is if a change in a particular component will have an impact on the other components. You just need to be aware of that. So if we were to give an example, if a simple change in terms of sowing equipment on farm, moving from knife points press wheel system to a disc sowing system. Okay, that's a simple change on farm. We could call a component there, it's the sowing system on farm, but that change will impact everything that you do. It impacts how much stubble that you'll be able to go through to establish your crop. So you can, with a disc system, you can establish in higher stubble loads. But on the other hand, the number of herbicides that are available to you, particularly pre-emergent or post-sowing pre-emergent sort of herbicides, is very limited. And so maybe you're limiting yourself there. And then there's a whole range of different factors that one change in the system can impact the whole system. And then we talk about the management of the system. So we've probably previously talked about this is the farmer that's managing, but as a consultant, you're providing advice on how they go about managing their system. And depending on how incorporated or integrated to the farm that you are, will depend on how involved in these management decisions that you are. So management, all it is a set of activities, all right, whether it's planning and decision making, organizing, leading and controlling, directing the organization's resources that we've talked about with the aim of achieving the goals. Okay, so management is about directing the resources that you have, we talked about them, to be able to achieve the goals. That's all that it is. Now, as a consultant, you can have a very large impact on both how that's done in terms of planning and decision making, as well as the resources, how to achieve that. And you could even, as a consultant, help that grower identify what their actual goals are. So the farm manager is responsible for planning and controlling all aspects of the farm system, designing, evaluating goals, identifying, responding to environmental influence, allocations of resources, and the timing of execution of those activities and processes. As a consultant, depending on how integrated you are in the farm decision making, but you can have an influence over a large number of those points. And so this is really key. Although you might not be the manager of the system, you have influence and you're providing advice. And so you'll be part of the planning and decision making, part of the organization. Even if you are selling product as a sales agronomist, you are likely to be organizing the delivery of all those products that enable these things to happen. So you're playing a role in the farmer's management. And you are helping organizing the resources available from that farm to achieve their goal. Really important component. Now, I've spoken previously about what's the role of the advisor. Sometimes, or often, it is giving the advice, but it's also the support around the advice, the hand-holding aspect, enabling or making sure that the farmer's not being on their own as they implement something that they haven't done before. And so in that way, the consultant is very close to what the farmer needs in terms of making those decisions. So finally, we're just going to briefly go over types of farm systems. And this is out there just because you need to appreciate that you could classify farms in different ways. It's likely if you're based within a particular region, there'll be large similarities between your farms, but there'll also be large differences between your farms. So you could talk about them in terms of degree of technology employed. All right, whether your grower, I would almost say in terms of cropping farming, everybody's got auto steer with GPS now, but maybe your growers has got green seeker equipment to control fallows versus another grower that you have that doesn't. Okay, there's differences in technology. What's the primary purpose of the enterprise? Is it making as much money as we can right now? Is it to provide for family? Is it to be with family? It's likely to be a mixture of all those things, but understanding your client is really important. The product that's produced, it might be merino wool, it might be high protein wheat, it might be chickpeas, might be cotton. They're all, we can classify it in that way, or we could talk about the use of inputs. All right, maybe they see themselves as a high input farm. We will throw everything we can at to produce as much as we can. Maybe they see themselves as a low input farm in terms of we will try and cut costs down at every turn. Or maybe it's an organic farm, and so the products available are much more limited. Okay, and what's the degree of managerial control over this farm? Okay, is it just a family farm where it's pretty much the farmer and pretty much has autonomy over all decision? Is it a larger farm, corporate farm that has a board and it has to respond to different decisions that the board makes? And then there's type of style of management of your farmer, and you'll see this. All these farmers go about their work in different sorts of ways. How do they do that? How do they like to communicate? Are they like to have a chat, or are they quiet? You need to, I guess, understand what your farmer is like. And that's going to lead us to the next mini lecture about understanding who our farmers are. I'll catch you next time.